We're going to look at several different signal displays or aspects. And for every aspect, I'm going to show you 3 different types of signals. They each look somewhat different, but they all give important information to an engineer about the operation of his train. This first type of signal is a searchlight signal. It can display all 3 colors, red, yellow, and green, from a single head. This is a tricolor signal, so named because there may be as many as 3 lights in each head, one for each color. If a signal does not have to display all 3 colors on a particular head, there may not be 3 lights in that head. And this is a B&O color position light signal. This type of signal was unique to the B&O and is only used by CSX on former B&O lines. There are a few other types of signals in use, such as Norfolk and Western and Pennsylvania Railroad position light signals, but for our purposes here today, we're going to look at just these 3 types because they're the most common. Let's start our look at signals with an aspect that's very easy to understand. Rule 292, stop. This is what a stop signal looks like in all 3 types of signals, and it means just what it says. An engineer seeing this signal must stop his train and wait for a more permissive signal or permission from the dispatcher to pass the stop signal before he can move his train. Another signal used often is Rule 290, called restricting. This is what a restricting signal looks like. It allows an engineer to move his train at restricted speed, which is a speed that will allow the engineer to stop before running through an improperly lined switch, broken rail, or before running into another train. This signal might be used when leaving CTC, or Centralized Traffic Control Territory. This might happen when leaving the main line to work on a lightly used branch line, for example. As the engineer leaves the main, he might see a restricting signal. That would tell him he has permission to enter the branch, but because there may be no signal system at all on the branch line, he has no signal protection against broken rails, improperly lined switches, or other crews working on the branch. A signal that you might see at the exit from a yard to the main line would be this one, called slow clear. Rule 287 tells an engineer that when he sees this signal, he can proceed at slow speed through turnouts, crossovers, sidings, and power-operated switches, and then he can proceed at maximum authorized speed. A railroad might use this signal for a train leaving a yard. As the train reaches the last switch before the main line, the slow clear signal would tell the engineer that he must leave the yard at slow speed, but once his entire train is by the signal and he's got everything on the main, he can accelerate to maximum authorized speed. If he started to accelerate as soon as the engine passed the signal, his train could easily be up to 20 or 30 miles an hour while the rear end was still in the yard. Now that wouldn't be a safe move because most yard tracks are laid out with sharp curves and small switches. That type of track just isn't safe for anything over 10 miles an hour. One other point. Did you notice that on the B&O signal, the green lights are flashing? Flashing lights are used to provide even more information to an engineer, such as on the limited signal aspects, which we'll take a look at in just a minute. What about trains already out on the main line, running at speed? What kind of signals do they usually see? Signal seen most often is this one, a high green or clear signal. This signal authorizes an engineer to run his train at the maximum authorized speed at that point on the railroad. So how does an engineer know when it's time to slow down? Well, there are several signals that help an engineer know this. Here's a signal that's seen quite often, approach medium. Covered under Rule 282, this signal tells the engineer that he can proceed, but he must approach the next signal at medium speed, which on most roads is 30 miles an hour. If the railroad uses long, high-speed turnouts, the engineer might see this signal instead, approach limited. Approach limited is virtually the same as approach medium, except that a higher speed called limited speed is authorized. Limited speed on most railroads is 45 miles an hour. Either of these signals would typically be used to tell an engineer that he was lined for the diverging route of a switch up ahead. In fact, on railroads that use route signals instead of these speed signals, this signal would be called approach diverging. This signal might be used when going from single to double track, or vice versa, or it could also be used in double track territory at a crossover when the route is lined for the train to cross over from one track to another. At the switch or crossover, the engineer will usually see this signal, called medium clear. This tells the engineer that he must proceed at medium speed through the diverging route of turnouts, crossovers, sidings, and power-operated switches. And when his entire train is clear of the switch, he can proceed at maximum authorized speed. Once again, on a railroad that uses route signals instead of speed signals, this signal would be called diverging clear. And if the railroad used high-speed turnouts, the engineer would probably see a limited clear signal at this spot. Limited clear, again, is virtually the same as medium clear, except that the higher limited speed of 45 miles an hour is authorized. Trains can take a lot of time and distance to come to a safe, smooth stop, and there are signal aspects that help an engineer know well ahead of time when and where he's going to have to stop his train. This aspect, approach slow, is one of them. Rule 284 tells the engineer that he can proceed, but he must approach the next signal at slow speed, usually no more than 15 miles per hour. Once again, this might be used as a train approaches a yard. If an engineer saw an approach slow on the distant signal, in other words, the last signal before the yard entrance itself, he would know that the switches are lined for him to go right into the yard without stopping. But he would also know to enter the yard at slow speed. But what about if the switches were not lined, or the yard wasn't ready for him yet? In that case, he would see this, an approach indication. Rule 285 tells the engineer that he may proceed, but he must be prepared to stop at the next signal. An engineer may also see an approach signal out on the main line, away from a yard, if he has a train close ahead of him, for example, or if he's going to stop on the main at a passing siding to wait for another train. In most rule books, the engineer is required to take immediate action to reduce the speed of his train upon passing an approach signal. This might mean moving the throttle back a notch or two, or setting the minimum reduction on the air brakes, or a combination of both. As you can see, these colored lights along the railroad give a lot of information to an engineer about how to run his train.